Shavua Tov, a good vach. It's great to be with you starting off the week. I'm sorry I wasn't with you last night. We had a wonderful time. We went to an opening of an art exhibit of work by Nina's mom, Judith Henry. It's terrific in downtown LA. We were really pleased and honored to be able to support her in that. And now we're back on Sunday night with a double daf. We're going to do 2 pages and get right back on schedule. Incredible, amazing, awesome material in this page. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather for a double daf starting off this week in style? Nancy in North Carolina, Yehuda in Florence, South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Paula in Chicago. Sharon, thank you so much. You sent us a bottle of this Chazak Kentucky Rabbi's Bourbon Cask Strength. Delicious. Thank you very much. We truly appreciate that. Paula in Chicago, Jane in Kansas City, Missouri, Pauline in Arkansas, Bill in mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, John in Sedona, Paula in the Great Northwest, Valsa in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Welcome, Valsa. There's a new name. Gloria in Southern California, Bella in Florida, Patrice in Utah, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, Dorothy in Pittsburgh, Scott in Pittsburgh. Sharon recognizes music by Rabbi Josh Warshawski, an old friend of ours. Wasn't that great? That was part 2 of a song we started playing on Friday, Hamera, from his album Chavarai Nevarech, Friends Let Us Bless. Zach is in Santa Monica. Welcome back to LA, Zach. Karen in Northern California. Heather loves it, likes the music. Scott says hello with love. Heather checking in from Hawaii. Dove in Boca Raton. Ann in Merced. David in Indiana. Everyone is getting this week started with a bang. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by Brian Gottesman, in memory of David Goldenberg. May his memory always be for a blessing. May the neshama have a great aliyah. And may our learning today accrue to his merit in the world of souls and lift him even a little bit higher. Brian, may you, and we say amen, and Brian, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. All right, we're picking this up at the bottom of 9b. Today we're wrapping up chapter 1 here in Tractate Chagigah. These are the laws of the festival offerings. We're completing our discussion of Mishna number 4 here in chapter 1. We'll do Mishna number 5, and then we'll open chapter 2 with Mishna number 1 of chapter 2. We pick it up at the bottom of 9b. Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish said, any Torah scholar who leaves the Torah, about him the verse says, as a bird that wanders from her nest, so is a man who wanders from his place. Proverbs 27:8. And it says, what unrighteousness have your fathers found in me that they are gone from me? Asks Jeremiah in chapter 2, verse 5. And this indicates that the punishment is greater for one who is close to God and became distant from him. A Torah scholar should know better than to abandon learning Torah for other pursuits. And in any case, why is this brought down here? In any case, there's a contradiction here, as in the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says that the act of one who fathers an illegitimate child, a mamzer, is crooked and cannot be straightened. Whereas in the bereshis, he says that the same applies to anyone who has forbidden sexual relations, regardless of whether or not he fathers a child. So we have this discussion, right? This already came up, that the idea that if a married Jewish woman has relations with a Jewish man who is not her husband, gets pregnant, the baby, that is a mamzer, right? This is a tragic situation for the baby, for the child, who through no fault of their own has this designation of mamzer. and is not permitted to marry other Jews. Surprisingly, can marry a convert. And there's a technicality in the law that permits that. And there's a few other groups that they can marry. Now, this mamzer situation, this is very tragic, right? So the child, through no fault of their own, has inherited this designation that's going to make it very difficult if it's an observant Jew, to marry in the Jewish community. Now, obviously, there are many Jews who are not observant and who won't care if somebody is a mamzer. The Reform movement doesn't recognize this at all. The conservative movement says, well, the condition of mamzer exists, but we will never designate somebody as a mamzer. We will not do that investigation. But in traditional Judaism, sure, it exists. And a traditional Jew won't marry someone who is a mamzer unless the Orthodox Jew happens to be a convert. There's a lot of laws and technicalities. Like the designation of mamzer is so difficult that even Orthodox rabbis will look for a way out, right? So if, for example, when the Jewish mother married her Jewish husband, if that wedding, if the ketubah was witnessed by Jews who are not Sabbath observant, then that can actually become an opening where the investigating rabbis will say, well, actually, she was never married, right? It was not a halakhically valid marriage. Therefore, when she had sex outside that marriage, it didn't produce a mamzer. That's the sort of investigating into the law to try to avoid designating someone as a mamzer. The mamzer status comes up more often than we would like to think, because if the Jewish woman was married to a Jewish man and they divorced in a civil ceremony, they had a civil divorce, but the get had not yet been given when she became pregnant by some other Jewish man, that child could acquire mamzer status. Very difficult. If there's any question in a situation in your life or someone you know, and you think, wow, that kid could be a mamzer, the first thing you should say to yourself is, I don't know. I don't know. This is a very difficult area of the law, and I need to consult with an Orthodox rabbi who is not just an Orthodox rabbi, but an expert in this area of the law, and then we'll see. This is really one of those situations where, doing a Google search, looking online, researching stuff, trying to figure it out on your own, doesn't work. Absolutely doesn't work. You must, if there's a question like this, consult a rabbi, okay? So that's on the issue of the mamzer. There's so many situations that you might think produce a mamzer, don't produce a mamzer. So we're definitely not going to the technicalities of that beyond the scope of this class. But since we've been discussing mamzer status, I'm just telling you that's something that requires a lot further investigation if it might apply to people you know. Okay. Now, the point here is, it seems like Shimon ben Manasseh said at one point, what does this verse, something that was straight that has been made crooked and cannot be made straight again, to what does it apply? To a Jewish man who has relations with a Jewish woman who's married to another man who's not him, and they create a baby, and that is a mamzer, so that can never be fixed. But in another place, the same Shimon ben Manasseh says, well, actually, even if they have prohibited sexual relations, whether or not there's a baby, this is something that was straight that has been made crooked and cannot be made straight again. So which is it? Is it only if you produce the baby that is a mamzer that you've made something that cannot be made straight? Or is there some, if you just violate the laws against prohibited sexual relations? Gemara answers, La kasha, this is not difficult. Here, the Mishna is dealing with a case where he had forbidden sexual relations with his unmarried sister. So he committed incest, right? He committed incest. Although the intercourse itself is a severe sin, If he does not sire a child, okay, so it can be rectified through repentance. But there in the Baraisa, it is referring to a case where he sinned with a married woman. So even though they didn't produce a baby that would be a mamzer, because she committed adultery, had sex with this man outside her marriage, then she becomes prohibited to her own husband. And that is why it is something that was made crooked that cannot be made straight. And if you wish, say instead, this and that are both referring to a married woman, and still it is not difficult. Here, there is a case with a rape, in which case, even though he had sex with this woman, he raped her, so they had sex, but she does not become prohibited to her husband because she did not do it willingly. A woman who is raped remains permitted to her husband. Whereas if she did it willingly, then she would become prohibited to her husband. And if you wish, say that this and that are both dealing with a case of rape, and the distinction that we're going to make is that the wife of a regular Jew, if she's raped, remains permitted to him, but tragically, the wife of a Cohen, even if she was raped, it was against her will that the sexual relations happened, she does become prohibited to him if he's going to remain a Cohen who can serve in the temple. In modern times, it's not such a big penalty. The Cohen will not be able to go up and make the Kohanic blessing in front of the congregation. He will probably choose to give that up and remain married to this poor woman who was raped through no fault of her own. These are difficult subjects. We're just talking about what is the law, not what is the equity and the emotional content of these rulings. Right now, we're just trying to understand what the law is. Since the Gemara mentioned a Torah scholar, we're on 10a now. Since the Gemara mentioned a Torah scholar who abandons the study of Torah, it cites a relevant verse. Neither was there peace to him that went out or came in due to the adversary. That's Zechariah 8:10. And Rav said, once a person leaves the study of halakha, of Jewish law, which in this context means Mishna and Gemara, the Talmud, even for the study of Torah itself, he will no longer have peace. The verses of the Torah are often obscure, and it is difficult to learn halakha directly from them without the aid of the interpretations of the Talmud. So one who was becoming educated, who was a Torah scholar, who was learning Talmud, and then he gives up his study and he says, I'll just read the Torah, I'll read the Parsha every week, it's enough, I don't have to keep studying. So this person will not have peace because he was on a track, to become a learned Jew, and he gave that up, and now he's going to become confused because there's so many laws that you cannot understand in the absence of the Talmud, of the commentary, of the Shulchan Aruch, in-depth learning of Jewish law. You're not going to get that from just reading the Bible, as it were. There are so many laws that are mentioned in the Torah that we can't understand without the oral tradition, like you shall bind these words as a sign upon your hand. They shall be a symbol before your eyes. That's tefillin. How do you know it's tefillin? What are the laws of tefillin? How do you put on tefillin? You're not going to learn that in the Torah, but these are very basic, important commandments. And Shmuel said, this is referring to one who leaves the study of Talmud to learn Mishnah. Whereas the reasoning of the Talmud is relatively clear, the Mishnah cites legal rulings without explaining their reasoning. So you can't give up your study of Talmud and just say, I'm only going to focus on the Mishnah, because again, the Mishnah was not fully elaborated. You need the Gemara to understand the Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan said the verse applies even to one who leaves the study of one Talmud for the other Talmud, i.e., who leaves off his study of the Jerusalem Talmud to begin the Babylonian Talmud, as he will encounter difficulties with this new style of learning. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 1. Mishnah number 5, the final Mishnah of chapter 1 here in Tractate Chagigah, the 13th volume of the Talmud. Mishnah number 5, incidental to the festival peace offering, the Mishnah describes the nature of various areas of Torah study. The halachas, the laws of the dissolution of vows, when one requests from a sage to dissolve a vow that he has made, fly in the air and have nothing to support them, as these halachas, these laws, are not mentioned explicitly in the Torah at all. There is only a slight allusion to the dissolution of vows in the Torah, which is taught by the sages as part of the oral tradition. The halachas of Shabbos, the festival peace offerings, which is why this is being mentioned now, and misuse of consecrated property, these areas of law are like mountains suspended by a hair, as they have very little written about them in the Torah, and yet the details of their halachas, their laws, are numerous. And now the third category, the details of monetary law, sacrificial rites like the avoda, the way the priests serve in the temple, the laws of ritual purity and impurity, and the laws of those with whom sexual relations are forbidden, all have something to support them, i.e. there's ample basis in the Torah for these laws, and these are in fact the essential parts of the Torah. Right, so here the sages are addressing directly the idea that there's many laws that we learn out of the oral tradition, and that they're going to fall into three categories. Some of them have like barely an allusion, a hint in the written Torah. Some of them, have like definite laws written in the Torah, but the expansion of those laws, the interpretation of those laws, the understanding of those laws in the Talmud is much, much bigger. And so that's a mountain that hangs by a hair. And then there's a third category where there's a lot of laws in the Torah. It still gets, a lot of expansion, interpretation, elaboration in the Talmud, but at least there the sages are interpreting a body of written law in the Torah. That's Mishnah number 5, the Gemara. And we're going to do a double daf today, so we're going to be skipping around a little bit, and I'll explain what it is that we're skipping so that we can complete 2 pages in about an hour. So the Gemara. It is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer said, the halachas, the laws of the dissolution of vows, have something to support them. As it is stated, when a man shall clearly utter a vow, Leviticus 27:2, and at Numbers 6:2, when either a man or woman shall clearly utter a vow, i.e. the words clearly utter, right, clearly mention, clearly speak, appear twice. One clear utterance is for prohibition, i.e. when one states his intention to accept the vow, and one clear utterance is for dissolution, when he provides the sage with a reason why the vow should no longer apply. And this is an allusion in the Torah to the annulment of vows. Right? So if you have made a vow, I will not benefit, I will not eat meat in this world. I will never eat meat again. And you make that as a vow before the Lord, a sacred vow, or I will not eat meat for a year, or I will not benefit, from my father, God forbid, anything like that. You make a vow, and then you realize, oh man, I never should have uttered that vow. Now, when you speak a vow, you are bound by your vow. But when you realize you made a huge mistake, you can go to a recognized sage and have that vow annulled. How do we know that? Does it say in the Torah that you can go to the leaders of your generation and have them annul your vows? No, it does not say that. But they're saying there's an allusion to that in the Torah because the clear utterance of a vow is mentioned twice, once for making it and once for having it annulled. And Rabbi Yehoshua likewise says, these halachas have something to support them, as it is stated, Psalm 95:11, wherefore I swore in my wrath, meaning in my wrath I swore, and I retracted. And this is the basis for the dissolution of vows, in which the one who uttered the vow tells the sage that he regrets it as he did so in a moment of anger, and if he had known what was involved in completing that vow at the time that he made it, he never would have made the vow, and that gives the sage what to work with in order to annul the vow. Now, what's important about this area of law is if you make a vow and you regret it, you can't release yourself from the vow. You have to go to the rabbi, who is a recognized authority, and say to him, I made this vow, I regret it, here's what happened, what I said, and then he can find, like the hinge to release you from your vow, but you can't do that to yourself. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, these halachas have something to support them. As it is stated, whoever is of a willing heart, let him bring it. Exodus 35:5. Now, this verse indicates that as long as one retains the same desire to fulfill the vow, so he must continue to fulfill it. But if he regrets taking the vow, he may arrange for it to be dissolved. Hananiah, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua's brother, also says they have something to support them, this law of annulling vows, and he has a different source. He says, Psalm 119, verse 106, I have sworn and have fulfilled it to observe your righteous ordinances. And this verse indicates that certain oaths need not be fulfilled, i.e., those that have been dissolved. Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, right? So now this is a saying of Shmuel that Rabbi Yehuda is bringing down. And Shmuel said, if I had been there sitting with those sages who were bringing down sources, which provides a basis in scripture for the annulment of vows by sages, I would have said to them, my source is better than yours. As it is stated, Numbers 30, verse 3, he shall not nullify his word, from which it may be inferred, he himself cannot nullify his word. However, others, a sage, may nullify it by dissolving his vow. And Rava said, for all of the suggested sources for the dissolution of vows, there is a possible refutation, except for that of Shmuel, for which there is no refutation. And Rava elaborates as, if it is derived from the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, well, perhaps the phrase, clearly utter, should be understood in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said, an alternative interpretation in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, as it is taught in a beraisa with regard to two people who are arguing whether or not someone who passed before them is a Nazir, one who made a vow not to benefit from the grape, and he will not cut his hair all the days of his Nazirus. And they were arguing about whether a particular person is a Nazir or not. And each of them, the sages who were arguing about this, declared that if he is correct, he himself will become a Nazir. And Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, actually neither of these sages is a Nazir, as Nazirus is effected only by means of a clear utterance. And neither party is certain that they will be a Nazir at the time of their utterance. And he derives this law from the use of clearly utter. And if clearly utter is used for that idea, that you can't make a conditional vow of becoming a Nazir if something happens, maybe it's I'm going to Nazir, maybe I'm not. You can only become a Nazir when you say, I hereby become a Nazir for a certain amount of time, whatever. Then there's words clearly utter are not free for this other idea, as a source for the idea of annulment of vows. And so there we discredit this as a source for Rabbi Eliezer. And now they're going to go through, Rav in the name of Shmuel, Rav Yehudis in the name of Shmuel, right? No, Rava is going to now show how each of these previous proofs that we mentioned doesn't actually work, but the proof of Shmuel, where it says, right, in Numbers, that I have fulfilled my vow, means that there are some vows you fulfill and some that you don't, which do you not fulfill. I mean, you have to fulfill a vow, but if there's vows that don't get fulfilled, which are they? The ones that have been annulled by a sage, and that proof will hold up. And about this saying of Shmuel, one spicy pepper is better than a basket full of squash, right? All these other, seemingly valid proofs don't hold up under scrutiny, but the one of Shmuel does. So he is the spicy pepper, or his proof is the spicy pepper amid a basket full of squash. So we skipped a few paragraphs as, Rava discredited those proofs. And now we go to the next subject, right? See these categories of law asking, do they have scriptural support in Torah or in the prophets or in the writings, or do they not, right? So the Mishna stated that the halachas, the laws of Shabbos, are like mountains suspended by a hair. And the Gemara asks, but the halachas of Shabbos are in the written Torah. It's written in the Torah, you shall keep Shabbos. We just had it in this parsha, right, Kitisa, that we read in synagogue yesterday, Vishamru, right, that we sing on Friday nights. That was part of this parsha, right, that you shall keep Shabbos, right? Of course it's written in the Torah. You will not work on Shabbos. Shabbos will be a cessation, that we celebrate Shabbos because God rested on the seventh day, etc. Of course it's in the written Torah. How can you say that the laws of Shabbos are a mountain suspended by a hair? I.e. the prohibition against performing labor is explicit in the Torah. And the Gemara answers, no, we say that there are mountains of law suspended by a hair. Why do we say this? It is necessary to say this in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Abba. As Rabbi Abba said, one who digs a hole on Shabbos only because he needs its dirt and not for the hole itself is exempt from liability for that act, as this is not the labor of digging prohibited on Shabbos by Torah law. Now, it's prohibited to dig that hole by rabbinic law. But wait a minute, what are you talking about? Digging, that sounds like the work of the week. When you build a house, you first dig a hole to make a foundation. That's constructive labor. Why would you say one is exempt for digging a hole on Shabbos? Because he needs the dirt. He needs the dirt, maybe to cover up something repulsive in the house. So he just takes some dirt. He leaves a hole. Yeah, he made a hole. But his purpose wasn't to dig a hole. His purpose was just to get some dirt to cover something repulsive on Shabbos. Now, maybe that's permitted, maybe it's prohibited, but it's going to be by rabbinic law. The Torah only prohibits constructive labor on Shabbos. How do we know that? The labors that the rabbis understand are prohibited by the Torah are the labors that were required to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. And we know that because when Moses was instructing the people how we're going to build the tabernacle, he also said, but you shall keep Shabbos, meaning that even the labor of building the tabernacle, the holiest structure in the history of the world up until that time, even that labor was halted for Shabbos. And all the different categories of labor necessary to build the tabernacle are the types of labor that are prohibited by the Torah on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion did Rabbi Abba issue this ruling? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who said, one who performs on Shabbos a labor that is not necessary for its own sake, i.e., he performs the labor for a purpose other than the direct result of the action, is exempt from liability for it. Okay, he dug a hole, but he wasn't trying to dig a hole. He was just scooping up some dirt to cover up something repulsive. Now, Rabbi Yehuda would say, yeah, but he dug a hole. Therefore, he is liable for violating Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon would say, no, because his purpose wasn't to dig a hole. As we've seen elsewhere, even Rabbi Shimon would concede that if it was inevitable that a labor would perform, right, there's a case of dragging furniture across a dirt floor and you're going to leave a furrow, right? Rabbi Shimon would say, well, you didn't meant to make a furrow, which is like when you're plowing your field, you leave furrows. If you drag furniture across the floor, your purpose wasn't to dig a furrow in the dirt floor, it was to move the furniture, which is permitted on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda said, yeah, but you left a furrow, so you violated Shabbos. But Rabbi Shimon would concede that if it's inevitable that you're going to leave that furrow, then you will be liable. Now, this case of digging a hole, because you leave a hole when you take out the dirt, that sounds like it's inevitable. We're not actually going to go there in the discussion right now. The point is that this idea that only labor, which is constructive labor, is what is prohibited on Shabbos, that is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. And so all the vast amounts of law that are related to this idea, which we studied in Tractate Shabbos, is like a mountain attached to the Torah by a hair in the discussion that we're having now. Okay, so we skip a little bit, and now we're on the B side of page 10. The Mishnah taught that the halachas of the Chagigah, the festival peace offerings, are like mountains suspended by a hair. And the Gemara says, but they are written in the Torah. The Torah says you shall bring festival peace offerings. How can you say that this is a mountain suspended by a hair? It's in the written Torah. And the Gemara answers, no. It is necessary to say this in accordance with that which Rav Papa said to Abaye. From where is it derived? That this verse, Leviticus 23:41, and you shall celebrate it as a festival, v'chagotem, to the Lord is referring to an animal offering. Perhaps the merciful one is simply saying, celebrate the festival, dance in the streets, party. How do we know that you have to bring these animal offerings on the festival? And Abaye responded, well, however, if that is so, consider that it is written, let my people go, that they may hold a feast, ve'yachoigu, to me in the wilderness, right? Moses said this to Pharaoh, let my people go, and we will take all our animals with us so that we can worship the Lord in the desert. We're going to need our animals. Why do we need our animals? It must be that we're going to bring offerings in the desert, and so that the way that we celebrate before the Lord is to bring these animal offerings, at least when we have a tabernacle or a temple. Today, we don't do that. And the Gemara raises a difficulty, but perhaps, well, let me finish that paragraph. So too, the meaning of this verse is that they will merely celebrate a festival and not bring an offering. And if you would say that it is indeed so, that this means that they should celebrate a festival, but isn't it written? And Moses said, you must also give into our hand sacrifices and burnt offerings that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And this shows that the command is referring to offerings. And the Gemara raises a difficulty, but perhaps this is what the merciful one said. Slaughter animals so that you can eat, drink, and celebrate. Maybe you needed animals just so that you can, eat meat and have joy at your dinner table while you're celebrating before me. How do we know that to celebrate a festival requires that we bring animal offerings to the Lord? Well, this should not enter your mind. As it is written, Exodus 23:18, the fat of my festival feast, Chagigah, right? Chagigah, the festival peace offering, right? That's the same word as Chag, right? Festival. Chagigah, my festival, shall not remain all night until the morning. And if it enters your mind to say that it is referring to a regular festival feast and not an offering to the Lord, does a festival feast have forbidden fats? There's, the fact that you must eat it by a certain amount of time, or then it becomes, ineligible, or that there are forbidden fats which can't be eaten by anyone, that doesn't pertain to just your dinner, right? I mean, there's parts of an animal that we don't eat because it's not kosher. That's a different body of law. But the idea that there are requirements associated with these, with burning these animals in order to celebrate the festival, it must be that there are festival offerings. And the Gemara will spend a little bit more time proving that. But the bottom line is there's a lot of laws that are associated with bringing the festival offerings that are not spelled out in the Torah, and that the sages had to figure out through allusion and interpretation and the oral tradition, because they were not spelled out explicitly in the written Torah. And so, in fact, some of the laws that they derive about the animal offerings were derived from the writings and the prophets, right? So from the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc., or from the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, etc. Well, you would say, well, that's explicit. It's in the Bible. How can you say that it's not explicit? And so therefore, how can you say that it's mountain suspended by a hair if there's explicit mentions of the offerings and how they are to be brought in the Bible, just not in the Torah, rather in the writings and prophets? And the Gemara answers, the textual evidence is not that strong, as generally one does not derive Torah matters from the texts of the tradition, i.e. the prophets and writings. Since the prophets were not permitted to introduce new laws, as the Torah is the only authoritative source in that regard, this verbal analogy does not carry the same weight as a law derived from the Torah itself. A law derived from the prophets and writings is not as authoritative as a law derived from the Torah. Here's a note from Rav Steinsaltz. The books of the prophets and the books of the writings are sometimes referred to as texts of the tradition, which literally means received matters. Now, some explain that this is because all the prophets received their prophetic status from Moses, the father of all prophets. Alternatively, the prophets passed down the tradition from the time of Joshua. Others say that this appellation refers to the fact that every prophet receives the prophecy that his generation requires. And some read the phrase as divrei kavala, matters of complaint, as the prophets mainly complain and protest over the sins of the Jewish people. Now, although many halachic concepts are derived from the statements of the prophets, verbal analogies derived from the prophets do not have the same status as verbal analogies derived from the Torah itself. Therefore, this is not a full-fledged verbal analogy. The Mishnah taught that the details of the halachas, the laws of misuse of consecrated property, are also like mountains suspended by a hair, right? So if you consecrated an animal to be brought as an offering in the temple, that has acquired sacred status. You can't use it for yourself. If you intentionally use it for yourself, you've committed a sin that's going to require serious atonement. If you unwittingly use that animal that was consecrated to be brought as an offering, and by mistake you got it confused with another animal, and now you ate that animal that was consecrated, okay, now you're going to have certain obligations to make up for your unwitting sin. Where do we get that whole body of law? So that it's going to be this mountain of law attached to the Torah by a hair, because these matters are not explicitly stated in the Torah. Says the Gemara, how can you say this is like a mountain suspended by a hair? They're written in the Torah. Leviticus 5:14 through 16. And Rami Bar Chama said, this statement is necessary only for that which we learned in a Mishna, Me'ilah, with regard to an agent who performs his agency. In other words, when a homeowner sends someone to buy an object with consecrated money, and the agent does as he was instructed, the owner has misused consecrated property, right? So I have some money, let's say it's Meiser Sheni, second tithe. I set that money aside, the temple is standing, I'm living in a period when the temple is standing. That money is supposed to be for me to go up to Jerusalem during Passover or Sukkot or Shavuos, and to have what to eat when I'm in Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festival, and the money can only be used for that purpose. But I make a mistake and I take some of that money and I give it to a friend of mine, and I say, here, or my employee, and I say, here, use this money, go to the store and buy us, 2 quarts of milk and a pound of flour. Okay, now I have misused consecrated property. But who is committing the unwitting transgression? My employee, my Jewish employee. I mean, he just did what I asked him to do. How can you say that he has any liability at all? I'm the one that misused consecrated property. Where this case gets interesting, however, is you're only going to be liable to bring an offering or whatever it is, the makeup, the way to redress this unwitting transgression, if it's unwitting. So if I take that money by mistake, I give it to my employee, I say, go buy the 2 quarts of milk and a pound of flour. He goes off, he's walking to the market. I remember, oh my God, that money's consecrated. I can't use that. I shouldn't have sent that, but it's too late. I can't stop him. And we live in a time without cell phones. I can't call him. So he goes and he spends the money. He's spending it in my name, but I am no longer committing an unwitting transgression. Now it's an intentional transgression because I know what's going on. He's the one who's now committing an unwitting transgression, and he actually becomes liable to bring an offering, a sin offering, for committing an unwitting transgression. My sin is worse, right? Because I became an intentional transgressor, but I can't bring an offering for that. I have to go through a different kind of atonement. He now becomes liable for the sin offering, which is brought for unwitting transgressions, because he spent the money unwittingly. He had no idea that there was any problem with this consecrated money. He had no idea that there was a reason not to spend it. And so he becomes liable for the unwitting transgression and bringing a sin offering. I don't, because I remembered in time. This whole body of law, not spelled out in the Torah. The sages have derived it. It is a mountain of law suspended by a hair that is attached to the Torah. In coming to understand who becomes liable when the one who sends his agent, when he remembers, at what point he remembers, that is like the subject of a bunch of paragraphs that we are going to skip because there's so much to cover tonight. We pick it up on page 11a, a few paragraphs down from the top. The Mishnah taught that monetary law is one of those matters that have something to support them in the Torah. Okay, now it's not a mountain of law suspended by a hair. Here's an area of law that is detailed in the Torah. There's a lot of laws in the Torah about issues of monetary law. The Mishnah taught that monetary law is one of those matters that has something to support them in the Torah. And the Gemara asks, monetary laws are written in the Torah. You know, like if your bull goes out and creates damage, if, you know, there's all kinds of areas of law where the Torah actually says, and you shall pay restitution. How much restitution shall you pay? What you stole plus 20%. Or you stole one sheep and you killed it, you have to replace it with 4 sheep, or a bull with 5 bulls. There's all kinds of laws where monetary restitution is actually spelled out in the Torah. So it would seem like it's not just something that has support in the Torah, it's explained in the Torah. The Gemara asks, monetary laws are written in the Torah. Why does the Mishnah merely say that it has something to support it? And the Gemara answers, this is necessary according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. What is it that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said that shows that monetary law, even though it's spelled out in the Torah, there's a whole bunch of laws relating to monetary law that are only hinted at in the Torah, that are not explicitly mentioned in the Torah? Well, Rebbe says, Exodus 21:23, but if any harm follow, then you shall give life for life, right? The very famous passage, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. Now this verse, the way the sages understand it, is referring to payment of money, right? So this is a situation where a negligent act led to a life being lost. There was no murder, right? So somebody committed some act of negligence. There was a problem. There's going to be liability, but we're not going to execute the one who committed this negligent act that led to somebody, God forbid, losing their life. How do we know that this verse, a life for a life, is referring to payment of money, liability for damages? It sounds like, well, the action that he did led to a life being lost, so even though he didn't intend to commit murder, he's guilty, he's liable, we should kill him. How do we know that that's not the case? And that the verse is referring to the payment of money? Do you say money? Or perhaps it is solely an actual life that is demanded. And the term giving is stated below. You shall give life for life. And the term giving is stated above in the previous verse. And he shall give as the judges determined. Now, just as there, the giving is in the form of money, so too here it is referring to a payment of money. Although this law is not explicit in the Torah, the verses lend support to it. And that's why this area of monetary damages has support in the Torah, but it is not explicitly stated in the Torah. The Mishnah stated that the laws of sacrificial rites, the avodah of the priest serving in the temple, has something of support in them. There are so many laws, particularly in the book of Leviticus, about all the different details of what the descendants of Aaron, the Kohanim, the priests, have to do to bring offerings, how they bring the blood, how they slaughter the animal, when they bring it, how they bring it, different kinds of offerings, what can disqualify an offering. I mean, this is an area of law that is spelled out in the Torah. How can you say there's only support for this area of law? But it is necessary to state that sacrificial rites have merely something to support them with regard to the right of carrying the blood to the altar in the daily offering, as it is taught in a bereshis, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer the blood. And this is referring to collecting the blood, which is the stage before carrying the blood to the altar. As you can imagine, there are many details of the daily offering, who slaughters it, how its blood is collected, how it's brought to the altar, that are not explicitly mentioned in the Torah. And so there's support for them in the Torah, but, the sages had to derive all of that. The Mishnah further taught that the laws of ritual purity have something to support them. And the Gemara again asked, but ritual purity is written explicitly in the Torah. How can you say it's only supported? These area of laws only has support in the Torah. And this is necessary with regard to the minimum measure of a mikvah, of a ritual bath. Right? There are laws which say that in order to become purified, for example, when you touch a corpse, and you're going to have to be sprinkled with the waters of purification on the 3rd and 7th day of the days you're counting until you become purified again, and then you immerse in a mikvah. Or a woman who has had her time of the month, and then she counts 7 clean days, and then she immerses in a mikvah, and then she and her husband become permitted to each other again for marital relations. How big must the mikvah be? That is not spelled out in the Torah. But in the Torah, it says that you shall fully immerse, that your whole body has to be inside the mikvah. What is the minimum size that a human body can get into? And they're basically going to say the bath that is 3 cubits long by 1 cubit high by 1 cubit deep. Right? Basically the size of a bathtub that a person could scrunch in and be fully immersed in water. How much does that hold? According to the volume of measure that was used in Talmudic times, 40 sa. Right? So it's a measure 40 sa. But basically 1 cubit by 1 cubit by 3 cubits. That's not spelled out in the Torah. There's support for it. There's understanding that you have to fully immerse. And then the sages derived how big the mikvah has to be. The Mishnah further taught the laws of those with whom relations are forbidden have something to support them. And the Gemara asks, the halachas of those whom relations are forbidden? That's written explicitly in the Torah. There's a long list of the arayos. People with whom you are not allowed to have sex, right? That it would be incest to have sex with these relatives. Okay, that list is very explicitly detailed in the Torah. How can you say that it is only support for with whom you're prohibited to have sex? It is explicitly written in the Torah, says the Gemara, and now we're on 11b. This is necessary only with regard to his daughter, born from the woman he raped, which is not written explicitly in the Torah. It is forbidden for this man to have sexual relations with his daughter, despite the fact that she is not the daughter of his wife, as he did not marry her mother. This is not explicitly mentioned in the Torah, but the rabbis derived it, and so there you go. There's a prohibited relationship that has support in the Torah, though it's not explicitly mentioned. As Rava said, Rabbi Yitzhak bar Avdimi said to me that this law is derived by means of a verbal analogy between the term they, henna, an unusual form of this word written in one context, and the term they written elsewhere, as it is written, the nakedness of a woman and her daughter you shall not take. They, henna, are near kinswoman. It is a lewdness is the translation here. Elsewhere I've seen it written as it is a depraved plot that a man would have sex with a mother and her daughter. And it is written, the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, even their nakedness you shall not cover, for they, henna, are your own nakedness. And this indicates that every daughter, even from the rape of a woman who is not one's wife, is forbidden, just like one's daughter from his wife. Thank God they worked that out. That makes a lot of sense to us. And that is going to conclude chapter 1. I'm just skipping another derivation of that same idea, but time is a little bit short. So now we move on to chapter 2. We are still on 11b. We're now in chapter 2 of Tractate Chagigah, Mishnah number 1, and now we get to something really, really interesting. Mishnah number 1. One may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations before 3 or more individuals, nor may one expound the act of creation, maaser bereshis, right? Not maaser, maaseh, right? Not maaser, maaseh, right? The action of creation, the doing of creation, that meaning the secrets of the beginning of the world. You cannot teach that before 2 or more individuals, nor may one expound by oneself Ma'aseh Merkava, the design of the divine chariot, a mystical teaching with regard to the ways of God and how God conducts the world unless he is wise and understands most matters on his own. Okay. You can't teach about forbidden relationships before three people. You can't teach about the creation of the world, right? The sort of received traditions about when and how God created the world, the angels that were present, what God was doing at the creation of the world. These are deep mystical matters. You can't teach that before two or more individuals. And about Merkava mysticism, right? Meaning like the nature of God, the inner understanding of who God is, how God thinks, how God creates the world, Kabbalah, right? Jewish mysticism. You shouldn't teach that to even one person. In fact, nobody should be learning that unless they're already so wise that they've basically already learned it. Jewish mysticism, very heady stuff. Why would they be so limiting with who can learn Jewish mysticism? Because unless you're already incredibly learned in scripture, in Mishna, in Gemara, in Shulchan Aruch, right? In Halacha, in so many different areas of Jewish law and tradition, you start studying Jewish mysticism, not just to kind of learn about God and what it is like to experience God's presence, but because you're going to try to make practical applications of that. It's called practical Kabbalah, like casting spells on people, stuff like that, or, tripping into the upper realms. You can seriously damage yourself and others. And that's why traditional ideas like Kabbalah mysticism, like you have to be at least 40 years old, and not just 40, you have to be very learned before it is permitted for you to do that. Otherwise, you can go into grave error and come to commit many transgressions. The Mishnah continues in the same vein, and whoever looks at four matters, it would have been better for him had he never entered the world. Anyone who reflects upon what is above the firmament and what is below the earth, what was before creation and what will be after the end of the world. And anyone who has no concern for the honor of his maker, for the honor of God, and who inquires into and deals with matters that are not permitted to him, deserves to have never come into the world. Right? The sages are being heavy-handed and saying that delving into mysticism is dangerous, dangerous stuff. And we have that famous teaching, it's not here, about the four sages who were pursuing these mystical matters. And so they entered Gan Eden. They went up into the upper realms. And only Rabbi Akiva went up there in peace and returned in peace. One of them died from these mystical journeys. Another one went insane. And Elisha ben Abuya, known as other, went bad. Right? In pursuing these matters, he actually turned bad. He became evil and became an enemy of the Jewish people and helped the Romans persecute the Jews. Right? That's how bad he went. That's the Mishnah. Gemara. The Gemara poses a question. You said in the first clause of the Mishnah, nor may one expound the design of the divine chariot. It's called Merkava mysticism because Ezekiel, when he has, his very, very trippy vision, right, of the upper realm, he talks about the divine chariot, and so that's where Merkava mysticism is based on, this sort of understanding the upper secrets. You see the divine chariot, as it were. It's not like, God rides around in a chariot with two wheels and a bunch of horses pulling it. It's, it's sort of like that upper world that sort of God occupies. And so it's called a chariot. It's called chariot mysticism. So you said in the first clause of the Mishnah, nor may one expound the design of the divine chariot by oneself, which indicates that the topic may not be learned at all. And yet you subsequently said, unless he is wise and understands most things on his own, which indicates that an individual is permitted to study the design of the divine chariot. How do we understand this contradiction? And the Gemara explains. This is what the Mishnah is saying. One may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations before three students, nor the act of creation before two, nor may one teach the divine chariot to one student, unless the student was wise and understands on his own. So if you've got two sages who are already very elevated in their background, their studies, their wisdom, okay, they can discuss these matters among themselves because they are unlikely to get into trouble by pursuing these topics. Sages who've spent their whole lives studying and have memorized everything, they can maybe delve into mystical subjects. We should be very cautious. Even if we're going to, and these days there's so many books of Kabbalah and practical and mysticism. There's so much available, but even though we read those books, we should, understand that there's so much about God that is a mystery. It's meant to be a mystery. It should remain a mystery. And even if we learn something, it's not like we've learned something about God that we weren't supposed to know. We've just scratched the merest little hint of what lies above. We haven't learned some secrets that we're suddenly privy to, that we got behind the curtain, as it were. We must be very humble when we learn anything of Jewish mysticism. And the Gemara continues to clarify the Mishnah, which reads that one may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations before three individuals. What is the reason for this? If we say it is because it is written, Leviticus 18:6, none of you shall approach any near of kin to uncover their nakedness. So this is the general, before there's a list of who is prohibited to you, there's this general teaching in Leviticus 18:6 that none of you shall approach anyone who is a close relative, near of kin, to uncover their nakedness, to have sex with them. But the way that none of you is written is ish, right? Often they repeat to emphasize, indeed you shall not. None of you, not any of you. Ish. Ish is the word for man. So ish, no man, not any man, right? So, but this repetition, ish, which literally means man. So this is understood as an allusion to the number of students that are permitted to study the topic. And this is as it is explained immediately. Man, ish equals 2. Any near of kin to him is 1. And the merciful one states, you shall not approach to uncover their nakedness, which indicates that one may not expound the laws of forbidden sexual relations in the presence of 3 individuals. You should only teach those laws, the teacher who's well versed in it, and 2 students. If he has 3 students or more, there's something wrong. They ask, if that is so, then what of this verse? Any man, ish, who curses God, Leviticus 24:15, or Leviticus 20 verse 2. Any man, ish, who gives up his seed to the Molech, which is a form of idol worship. In both cases, the double expression implies the number 2. So are you saying that there, in those cases, also it is prohibited to teach those laws before more than 2 students? And the Gemara answers, no, rather those instances of the double expression ish are required for him, the Tana, who is teaching this, in order to include Gentiles who are commanded with regard to blessing, which is a euphemism for cursing God, and with regard to idol worship, just as Jews are commanded, meaning non-Jews. It's one of the Noahide laws. You can't curse God and you can't worship idols the same as Jews. Non-Jews who would have, are exempt from 606 of the 613 commandments, which obligate Jews, but they are commanded in the 7 Noahide laws, and these are 2 of them. Rather, but if so, the mention of ish in the case of forbidden relations is also required for him to include Gentiles who are commanded with regard to forbidden sexual relations, just as Jews are. These laws of forbidden sexual relations also bind non-Jews. So rather, the Gemara rejects the previous explanation and suggests that the prohibition against teaching 3 is derived from a different source entirely. It is derived from the following verse stated with regard to forbidden sexual relations. And you shall observe my charge. Leviticus 18:30. After the list is given of the forbidden relations, it says, you shall observe my charge, which is explained as follows. And you shall observe ushmartem in the plural. And that indicates At least two. My charge is one, and the merciful one states at the conclusion of this verse that you do not perform any of these abominable customs, indicating that this topic may not be taught to three. The Gemara doesn't like this derivation, says, however, if that is so, then what of that which is written in, you shall observe the Shabbos, Exodus 31:14, and you shall observe the festival of matzahs, Exodus 12:17, and you shall observe the charge of the sacred things, Numbers 18:5. So too will you say that none of these subjects may be taught in front of three or more students? The same derivation that you used to say why you can only teach forbidden sexual relations to two or fewer students at a time, you're not going to apply that to the laws of Shabbos or the laws of eating matzah on Passover. So Rav Ashi said, no. These scriptural allusions are unacceptable. What is the meaning of one may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations before three or more students? It means one may not expound the concealed laws of forbidden sexual relations before three or more. The prohibition against teaching before three applies to the laws of forbidden sexual relations that are not explicitly stated in the Torah, but are derived by expounding the verses through analogy. What is the reason? It is not due to a biblical illusion, but rather it is based on logical reasoning. And this is great. Now the sages get right into human nature. When two students sit before their teacher, okay, so one of them is typically involved in a discussion of law with his teacher, and the other one listens to them having this discussion, and so he's learning from the teaching. However, if three students are before the teacher, one of them is involved in a discussion with his teacher, while the other two are in a discussion with one another. And they do not hear what the teacher is saying, and they may come to render permitted a forbidden relation. Right? They're saying that you can't teach the laws of prohibited sexual relations, who you're prohibited to have relations with, in front of three or more students, because in the course of the teaching, it might happen that the teacher and one of the students is having a conversation, the other two students aren't paying attention, they're having their own, and let's say it's not because they're daydreaming, it's because they're having their own halakhic discussion, and they didn't hear what the teacher said. So they didn't hear that in this one particular case, somebody is prohibited to another person because they weren't paying attention, but they think they took the class on prohibited sexual relations. So later, when they become rabbis and they're the rabbi of a community and someone comes to say to them, there was this weird case, on my own grandpa, like there was, weird circumstances where somebody came to have sex with an unexpected person and it produced a child. Did this create a mamzer or not? Since they didn't hear the law properly on that day because they were having their own conversation while the teacher was teaching their colleague, they would say, oh yeah, no, that's okay. This one's not a mamzer when he is a mamzer. And then unfortunately, this one who is a mamzer marries someone who didn't know they were marrying a mamzer, etc., causes all kinds of problems. So what they're saying is these laws are so important, have such, extensive consequences, because the Torah says, as Sharon pointed out on Friday, that if someone really is a mamzer, their children are mamzers too for 10 generations. The problem compounds itself in each generation subsequently, and you can't take any chances with this body of law, and therefore you only teach it to two or fewer students at a time in rabbinical school, right? That kind of idea. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. Well, if so, the entire Torah should likewise only be taught to two individuals to prevent similar errors. I mean, are you saying that other areas of the law are not so important? So if the two students are having a conversation, they didn't hear what the teacher said when he was talking to the third student in the class and they missed it? I mean, they could come to give all sorts of erroneous rulings for the same reason. And we have a teaching elsewhere that, we don't know which mitzvah is more important than another. All the mitzvahs are equally important. So maybe it should be that no class where rabbis are being educated should ever be taught to more than two people at a time. And the Gemara answers, the law of forbidden sexual relations is different. For the master said, robbery and forbidden sexual relations are sins that one's soul covets and lusts after. Therefore, we are concerned that one who has not properly studied these matters with his teacher will rule leniently for himself. These guys who weren't paying attention might come to say, oh yeah, I can have sex with that person. Their lust will be so strong that they'll be biased in making their ruling for themselves. And the Gemara says, well, if so, robbery should also not be taught to more than two for the same reason. And I'm almost done, so if you have any questions or comments, get them in. Robbery should also not be taught to more than two for the same reason. And the Gemara responds, there is a difference between lust for forbidden sexual relations and the lust for robbery. In the case of those with whom relations are forbidden, his evil inclination is strong whether or not the objects of desire are before him. With regard to robbery, however, okay, if the object presents a direct temptation before him, then his inclination is strong. But when the object is not in front of him, his inclination is not strong, and we are therefore less concerned that he will come to rule leniently for himself on whether or not it's permitted to take this thing that doesn't belong to him. But, human lust is so strong that they might, set aside what they've learned or didn't really want to know so that they can, go have the object of their lust. Okay, that's what we've got today. I know we ran long. It's been 1 hour and 7 minutes, so I'll just take a few questions, not so many. Sharon, I have heard that rabbis advise people who are adopting that it is more advisable to adopt a non-Jewish infant and to have it properly converted rather than to adopt a Jewish child, since it is possible that it could be a mamzer. And so, exactly, there we see, how difficult this area of law is. Now, while that may be true, if no one really knows where that child comes from, okay, it's possible that it's a mamzer, and so some people may not want to adopt or marry that child when it grows up, but out of doubt, somebody won't be declared a mamzer, right? They have to know that it is a mamzer before they're going to stick that designation on the child. So that's another area where the rabbis are going to, really be very careful, and why in these kinds of issues, you really always have to consult with a rabbi. Bill, now, inquiry from the theologian in the room. Given that the Merkava, the Merkava mysticism, the chariot as referred to by Ezekiel, includes the discussions of what we may call the inner life of God, what separates that from theology students inquiring into the doctrine of God? That is, matters such as how can God be both one and infinite at the same time and similar. Speaking for myself, we covered a simplified version of those elements in Theology 101, though of course a full study of it would be the work of a lifetime. And I guess Sharon responded, as one who studied for nearly 6 years at the Jewish Theological Seminary, I can tell you that a question like that doesn't come up even in Theology 101. No such class like that is taught. It presumes a finite quality to God that is not adopted by Jewish theology. We do not presuppose that understanding of the Merkava. How can God be both one and infinite at the same time? I'm thinking, wasn't it George Carlin does a whole routine on can God make a rock so big that he himself can't lift it? Right, and so those are the kinds of questions. You just have to be so careful what you're asking, with whom you're discussing. First of all, Bill, you're not Jewish, as you've shared with us many times. You're not going to be bound by the same limitations as a Jew is bound on asking these questions. And then, are we talking about people just, shooting the breeze, having a beer, asking these questions? Is that really deep mystical discussion of the type that is not allowed to be taught? Or is it more, there's a whole body of Jewish mystical learning that the sages passed down, originally received from Moses, to the judges, to the prophets, to the men of the great assembly? Most of that is the revealed Torah, even if it's part of the oral tradition. And then there's aspects of it that are the hidden Torah, right? What can I say? Parts of it are just not going to be permissible for us to delve into. Parts of it can be delved into with very experienced people who have learned some of it on their own, one-on-one. Right? I could share with you what the Gemara said about this, and I have. More than that, case-by-case basis, consult your local rabbi. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. Very exciting, very interesting, very deep page. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night to continue our discussion, and it remains fascinating, of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Chagigah when we continue with page 12.